I hope you can hear me now. I think there may have been a little audio issue there. So, welcome to our lecture this evening. This is called The Moon Mysteries. And the Moon Mysteries is actually part of Revival. So, thus far, I've aired 2 episodes of Revival, and this is all about the feminine mystery. So, the feminine aspect of the occult, the feminine aspect of the mysteries, which is greatly misunderstood and greatly neglected. And the moon and the lunar mysteries are very closely tied with the feminine, and a lot of the understandings about the moon and the relationship between the earth and the moon are big foundations of the feminine side of the mystery. So, along with me airing Revival, which is a narrative series, I'll also be doing lecture portions with it that are called Moon Mysteries. So this is the first episode of Moon Mysteries and Revival, and we are going to be talking about what the moon is. And it's kind of odd that we have to do this because there's so much strange information about the moon that really doesn't have any spiritual foundations at all. And so that's what we're going to get into today, what the moon really is, but beginning with what the moon definitely is not. So just so you know, the first portion of this talk is going to be on YouTube and Rumble and public. The last portion, which is the question and answer session, that's going to be on my private platform on gigiyoung.com for members. So I'll only be doing member questions. So if while you're watching this evening and you are not a member, then you may want to sign up, and the link will be in the chat throughout the session today. So you can do that. It's also in the description, I believe. So if you have a question that you're developing, do consider signing up for that. So, what is the moon? Well, materialist science will tell you that the moon is just a rock in the sky. It's just basically a physical object. And materialist science doesn't actually acknowledge that the spiritual world exists. It's just a close-up on basically the mineral existence of things. So we can't actually look to natural science to tell us anything about the moon other than its physical properties and its mineral aspects. That's it. So if we're just looking to natural scientists, we're not going to get a holistic, real view of the moon, right? We're just going to get the material part of it, which actually leaves out completely the spiritual. But then when you go into the spiritual community, there's also a lot of confusion that you can find about the moon as well. And I would say the most popular thing that I hear about the moon is that the moon is basically a robot, that the moon is actually a mechanical device, that the moon is artificial, completely artificial. It has no real connection to the earth at all. And it's just this artificial body, often brought here by alien beings, or sometimes people don't know how it was brought here. But the main thrust of a lot of arguments in the New Age and the conspiracy culture is that the moon is this wholly unnatural body, and it has nothing to do with the earth. And these conversations can go so far as to say that the moon is actually some kind of surveillance device, that it's a weapon, and that there are forces in the moon, often again mechanical, like technologies, that bear down on humanity, controlling it. So the moon, in parts of the spiritual community, has actually evolved to become this like robotic mind control device that's in the sky, that has no relationship to humanity, no intrinsic relationship to humanity at all. And so the moon is evil. The moon is not of the earth. It's a control mechanism. And so when I look at these different theories, it becomes very obvious that we've lost the kind of elegance and the kind of sophistication that comes with real spiritual understanding, or real holistic spiritual understanding. And if we're not getting materialism on the natural science side that doesn't even see the spiritual aspects of the cosmos, then we're getting spiritual materialism on the other side that wants to say that the way that anything comes into being is through, some kind of alien creator race, and that anything that has power is actually a machine. And that's just spiritual materialism, where you can't actually observe the real spiritual meaning and properties of anything, especially the transformational nature of something, the life of something. It automatically gets turned into this like weird mechanical device. And if you are familiar with Rudolf Steiner's work, this is the mark of the Ahrimanic age, the age of Ahriman, which seeks to turn everything into a machine, to mechanize everything, and to even get to the point where human beings externalize everything and materialize everything so much that even the most sacred parts of us suddenly are forgotten, and we try to turn into, basically a technology, a chip or a device or something like that. It's the externalization and materialization of spirituality. That's what we're looking at. And we can see it very, very, very clearly with the moon. So I won't be going any deeper into why the moon is not a spaceship, okay? But I do address this in prior lectures that I've done, which would be Angels to Aliens, the Dark Side of Disclosure, and the Esoteric Keys of Disclosure, and also Mars Mystery. So if you need to hear any more about that, that's where you're going to find that discussion in depth. So modern discussions about the moon are spiritually empty and do not include the esoteric reality and purpose of its existence. While these materialist discussions are entertaining, they are more like junk food. They're stimulating to the senses, but provide no sustenance, no nutrition, no actual spiritual truth. And that's actually what we see a lot on social media, on TikTok, on YouTube, is this bizarre fusion of spiritual principles, spiritual language, spirituality, but packaged just to be sensational, packaged just to be entertainment. But the problem is our subconscious mind doesn't understand that this is entertainment, and people begin to believe that material that's basically created carelessly for clicks or just for entertainment, people begin to think that this is the reality of their existence, that these things are real. And so it's very important that we have a very strong foundation in spiritual science to confront all of these sensational, meaningless things that we see around us on social media every day, because sensationalism, negativity, weird conspiracies are pushed to the top of the algorithm very often. So we have to have a counter strike for that, which is a very strong knowledge of spiritual science, which is what we're going to get here today about the moon. So materialist science cannot describe the moon beyond its most basic physical attributes, which leaves natural scientists' discussion incomplete, as they do not address the spiritual properties of the moon. The spiritual community often fails us in regards to the moon, as the moon is frequently described as an artificial body created by aliens to surveil and control humanity. None of these descriptions address the actual origin of the moon, nor its relationship to humanity and the earth. So let's discuss what the moon really is and our relationship to it. Because one of the things that always struck me about how wild these theories about the moon being artificial has become is it kind of, spits in the face of a lot of really powerful and complex and true spiritual studies like astrology. What does it mean for astrology if the moon is basically this weird robot spaceship that was brought here by Enki or Enlil or something? What does that do? There's no meaning in that. There's zero meaning in that. Because there hasn't been a transformational spiritual force that's created the moon. It's not part of humanity. It's brought here by something, right? And now I know a lot of people do not adhere to this, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir here a little bit. But I just want to draw this contrast because I think these ideas do need to be contrasted just so that we can see the truth more brightly and also see that harmonic thread. So the moon, what it really is and where we should begin with the moon is that the moon is actually an entity. The moon is a spiritual being. The moon is a living spiritual being. And the physical moon, so when you look out and you see the moon or you measure the distance between the moon and the earth, that's actually the moon realm. And that's actually a different realm of creation. That's actually a different realm of the cosmos. So we have the earth realm, which we live in, and then we have the moon realm, and then we have these other realms that are planetary realms as well, like the Mars realm, the Venus realm. These are all the different realms of heaven, or the rungs in the ladder of Jacob, okay? So when we start to view the planet as a realm, as the outer boundary of a realm, we start to get a lot closer. When we start to view the moon and really any planet as a being, we start to get a lot closer, okay? The moon realm itself, and therefore the body of the moon, is governed and is the actual substrate of angels. So our whole cosmos is actually what's called the spiritual hierarchy or what's called the angelic hierarchies, which means that there are actually spiritual beings of different orders that govern the cosmos. Now, I have done lectures on this in the past on the spiritual hierarchies. So if you're interested in that, do check that out. But the realm that is delegated to the angels is the realm of the moon. So the body of the angels stretches from the earth all the way up to the moon. And everything that happens in that realm is happening within the body of the angels. Okay? So this is another important thing to understand when looking at the dimensions of the cosmos, is we're not looking at a simulation. We're not looking at a hologram. Okay? We're not looking at a machine cosmos at all. That's just how the lower portion of the cosmos looks to the uninitiated. When you actually look out into the cosmos as a living being, you see it as a series of living beings. So you see it as a hierarchy of angels. And every function that's carried out, every time it rains, every ripple in the water, every planet is a being. It is beings within beings within beings, and it's very important to understand that because we are a being. So this is another important adjustment, to remove this idea of a machine cosmos and place us correctly in the position in which we can actually experience spiritual initiation, which is we have to be a being in classes of beings because that's how we rise in our own initiation. So the moon, and this is where we're going to focus primarily in this lecture today, is this one concept, because when we get this, it also deepens our understanding of different spiritual disciplines like astrology, is that the moon was actually once united with the earth. So the moon and the earth were actually once one substrate. They weren't separate. The moon and the earth were united before the earth condensed and materialized into a mineral condition, into a material mineral condition. And when the earth materialized, the moon split off. So the reason why we're so deeply connected to the moon, and people feel the new moon, some people feel so deeply the full moon, and why our ancestors and pagan traditions did things according to the moon, is because the moon was literally part of the earth for a third of its development. The moon is actually part of the earth. So this is why the moon has power. Okay, this is also why other planetary spheres have power too, because there are also aspects of the sun and of the earth as well. However, their mitosis from the earth, or their splitting from it, took place in different ways, and that's a deeper mystery of the cosmos we're not going to get into today. We're going to stick to the moon. But what we can see in the patterns of the moon and the mitosis of the earth and the moon, or the splitting in the, or sometimes Rudolf Steiner calls it the extrusion or the ejection of the moon. This is teaching us of something very, very deep about ourselves, our Earth's development, and about the spiritual hierarchies that are carrying out the function of the extrusion of the moon, and that are the moon itself. Okay? So because the moon was once united with the earth, was part of the earth, they were one coalescing force, and then they split, we can also view the moon and we can see that as humanity's past. So a lot of the times when you'll see, like in occult literature or like the mystery play Faust, there's references to the three mothers of the moon, the forces in the moon, and a fear of it. Well, that's the past. That's the underdeveloped self. That's the parts of us that had to be left behind because we couldn't fully integrate them. So the moon represents sort of the underdeveloped parts of ourselves. It also represents sort of underdeveloped aspects of the spiritual hierarchies that have fallen behind. And it represents the past. It represents the past condition of the earth and a past condition of humanity itself that we've evolved out of. That's the moon. So the experience of the moon is backwardsness. So a lot of the time when you see the symbolism of our interaction and experience with the moon, it's like going through a mirror. And there's always this idea of the earth kind of being surrounded by this mirror realm. You know, when you pass away, if you remember in my lecture called The Mystery of Death, we experience Kamaloka. Kamaloka is the moon realm. That's the Eastern phrasing for the moon realm. And when you enter that, you have what? You have a life review. You experience your life backwards because the moon and the forces within the moon are an inversion of that of the earth. It's a mirror plane. This is also why you have to re-experience things upon death. That's the core force of the moon and you experiencing it, right? The moon realm. And so in the Persephone myth, Alice in Wonderland, which we'll cover quite a bit in Revival, Alice through the looking glass goes through what? She goes through the looking glass, the mirror, the moon. So this symbology of diving into the moon, diving into the mirror is very much a deep part of the feminine mysteries, and the moon is a feminine symbol. So the experience of the moon is as though you're being inverted, as though you're being unzipped. And so here we can talk about the moon in different ways. We can talk about the objective reality of the moon, which is that it was ejected from the earth. We can talk about the spiritual forces that are involved in that, why, the developmental condition of the moon. But then we can also talk about the personal experience of the moon and its effect on our psyche and what it feels like when our soul passes into the moon. So there's this objective explanation, which is spiritual science, and then there's a personal experience of that, and they're both important when we learn about this. So another very important thing about the moon that is never mentioned in modern spirituality, but has been a core foundation in the lunar mysteries and mystery schools for a very long time, is that the moon will return to the earth. That the moon will one day, the earth is in the process of spiritualization. You know, the New Age calls this ascension, right? But the Christian mysteries call this resurrection. And the earth and humanity is spiritualizing, right? And as we become less dense, eventually we will reabsorb the moon into the earth, which represents coming full circle. And then the earth will be absorbed into the sun, which is connected with the idea of rapture, the return to the Christ, the return to sun, and there's a transformation of our body at that point. So it's very important that we understand the lunar mysteries because it is so deeply tied to our spirituality and just kind of this macro view of our earth and our development, right? So the moon was once united with the earth, and the moon made up one primeval spiritual body, one essence. And over time, this body was what we could call moon earth or earth moon. And it split. And as the moon split, and this is important as well, it took certain spiritual forces with it. You could say, Theosophy would say these are the laggard forces. These are forces that were sort of behind. All right. And so this means that when we look at the physical moon, that it is an illusion. What we're really looking at is an array of spiritual beings associated with a prior era of cosmic development. The physical moon is merely a marker or a gate that indicates spiritual activity. So this is how far we've fallen from our own birthright as spiritual beings, is like all we ever hear about the moon is like landing on it, like someone went and got like a moon rock and maybe we didn't land on it. The Freemasons are on the moon, and we just hear about it as a physical thing. But look, in 20 minutes, we've already covered so many important topics that go so far beyond that. So the physical moon is really a marker or a gate that indicates a certain kind of spiritual activity is taking place in between its boundary. And you better believe that people in NASA, that individuals that are part of space forces and things like this, you better believe that they have this basic occult knowledge. It is the unwashed masses, it is us who are behind on the occult understanding of the planetary spheres and the moon. So when we look to the moon, we see many things. We see humanity's past. We see the realm of the angels. We see an array of beings that are archetypally backwards to ourselves. We see an aspect of the Divine Mother. Why is the moon at Mary's feet? Why is it there? Why include that? Why is the moon associated with the feminine? Okay, this is what we're going to continue asking in our next lecture. We see also a future step of our own evolution. With the moon's reabsorption into the earth, we see the healing of the fall and the spiritual ascent of the earth. So all of these psychological, spiritual events we can directly associate with the cosmic bodies and our relationship to them, including the ultimate spiritualization of our form, or really the ending of the planetary cycle, because everybody's path is a little bit different there. So some of you may be hearing that the moon and the earth were one body at one time and be like, wow, that I didn't expect that. You think of the moon having formed in every other way, but maybe that. And so let's get into how that happens. Let's understand in detail how the moon and the earth could be one coalescing body and then like separate off into two. And now there's this thing orbiting us. Let's get into that. So the main thing is that the deepest reason as to why the Earth and the Moon separate is because that's how we evolve. So evolution happens through essentially two opposing forces that are spiraling in different directions, coming together, and then creating matter, creating mass. But these aren't just two spiraling forces that are coming together. These are actually spiritual beings or hierarchies of spiritual beings that are working in opposing condition relative to man that end up coming together and creating a third force, which is materiality. So behind every planet, actually, you're going to find two opposing vortexes coming together and producing matter. So matter or mass is the result of these two opposing vortexes, centripetal and centrifugal. Okay, now this is sort of, getting a little bit into physics, but we'll just kind of go nice and slow. So if you were to look behind the Earth, if you were to look behind the Moon, what you would really see clairvoyantly is spiritual forces spiraling together. And then everything that sprouted forth, creating that third entity, is what we call Maya, which is what we call the manifestation of the material world. So a planet is actually two forces that are pushing against one another to create everything that we have. Okay? So this is actually where you get the image of Solomon's seal, or the key of Solomon, which is one triangle pointing upward and one triangle pointing downward. These are the vortexes of creation that create every single planet, that create every single human being that is behind every physical force. Are these two opposing vortexes that come together and spill forth life. Okay? Now, this is explained also in my Light in the Void lecture. Okay, this is the last one that I did a few months ago, Light in the Void. That is the mythological description of this process. Okay, and this is also very clear in Walter Russell's work. So if you want a little bit more of a detailed explanation of the physics than I can give today, then you want to look at Walter Russell. And so it's really these opposing spiritual beings, these forces that make up matter. And when you have a planet come to be from these kind of opposing forces, a human come to be, that mass comes together to be the integrator, the harmonizer, the force that you could say embodies and brings together or overcomes, integrates those two things, right? So that's what the human being is. That's what the planet is. It's harmonizing and integrating those two opposing forces. That's why it comes to be on a deeper level. And so that's how you get the creation of a world, the creation of a planet. And through that also the creation of a human being. That's how your energy body is actually. Your energy body also is two spirals meeting and crashing together as well. So you have this mass that is now created. And you have these forces spiraling into it that are really the reason why it exists. And over time, the planet, you could say, becomes fructified by the higher spiritual forces. And this creates the evolutionary impulse in it, right? And that creates, if you will, two streams within the planet's existence. And then eventually, the force of life, the force of evolution itself, draws the lower and the higher. There's a bifurcation and they separate. Okay, so over a planet's evolution, it naturally will produce a moon. That's part of planetary evolution. So as the planet evolves and becomes fructified by God, by Christ, naturally there's a kind of like a dross that forms that initially is an antagonistic force, but then is drawn out, is cast out. And then as humanity evolves and heals, it's drawn back in, and there's a spiritual process that is the sort of re-enmeshment of the moon. Okay. And so this has actually happened repeatedly. So we're looking at this and we're like, it's strange that we could see the moon as once being part of the earth and separating off. But this is actually part of how the cosmos evolves. Okay, so the earth has really gone through this several different times. And so there's actually been 7 different evolutions of the planet where it has gone through the separating off of certain forces and then periods of remerging. And that's what actually creates the mechanism of evolution. Okay, that's what also creates, you could say, 2 streams. You have one stream that's sort of ascending, and then you have one stream that's also descending. Okay, and so that can create a bit of an opposing force as well. And we're going to get into this at the end of the lecture with the motif of the battling brothers and how this mystery of the spiraling vortexes that create all matter and the different streams from the spiritual hierarchies, the different streams that exist in you, different impulses that exist in you, how that was portrayed in earlier periods when we couldn't exactly mathematically talk about it, right? So each planetary evolution produces a higher body that reunites with the sun and a lower body that's like a dross that remains sort of in matter, that becomes denser, and then it produces sort of new base elements. So this is actually the mechanism of creation, the mechanism of how the planet evolves and how souls evolve on the planet. So this is why it's important to understand the moon, is because that's how we understand the mechanism of our own evolution. Okay, so behind all matter, everything in the mineral world, are 2 opposing vortexes of spiritual energy whose collision creates matter, whose collision creates a condensation. How Rudolf Steiner describes it is you have one vortex going one way, another vortex going the other way, and it creates like a shattering, like a cascade, a breaking apart of substances. And then as the spiritual beings are around it, the beings of the hierarchy are around it, their imprint forms it into the new world. But because it's a smaller fragment, it's like a condensation. So it's a shattering, creating a denser substrate. And then the spiritual hierarchies, the angels that are active within their hierarchies, will form that together, and it's in their image that this denser element is created. Okay, so there's this sort of shattering, if you will, of spiritual forces that creates matter. While we cannot physically perceive these 2 vortices, we can see their imprint in nature. You see, the Fibonacci sequence, and you can see these patterns often, which is a direct representation of literally the forces that are happening behind man and earth. So over time, because the physical plane is the result of these opposing forces, the force of life eventually begins to draw out what is like it and resonant with it, and what it fructifies. As a result, a lower body is ejected as dross. This dross is our moon, is the kingdom of the earthly past. It surrounds the earth for a period of time and then is reabsorbed, and the earth reunites, and then the earth reunites with the sun. So this process of reunion with the sun is called the rapture, as many of you guys know that have seen me lecture on this before. And I'm bringing the sun in here a little bit to kind of give it a little bit more scale. So we're not just talking about the moon and its relationship with the earth. We also have to talk about the sun a little bit, because just as the moon is reabsorbed into the earth, so too are we reabsorbed into the sun. So it's kind of like the earth is like a moon of the sun in a way. So we're looking at, when we bring the sun into it, we're looking at evolution on a larger scale and our spiritual development on a much larger scale, more precise scale as well. When we observe the separation of the moon from the earth, we can see that that process is part of the greater mechanism of evolution in the cosmos. It is how all planets come to be, and even how the human body and all beings materialize. And this is why in the Eastern traditions, they would say, you know, everything that we see is Maya. It's illusion. It's not really here. It's because there's these incredible spiritual forces behind matter, literally creating matter from themselves, that are patterning it from themselves, that we are operating in and being the mediators of. And so you can see how in Eastern spirituality, they would see that this world is not all that there is, and that this world is a manifestation of much greater beings through laws that are even difficult to understand. But we know that you can, in a way, call this an illusion, because there is this life spinning behind it that pre-existed it, and that we're in a chain of development with beings much greater than ourselves, right? And one day this world will collapse and be reborn too. And so when you have that zoomed out macro look at things, you can see how, you know, in the Eastern traditions, they focused on the Maya thing. It was because we can't forget that we are spiritual and that we come from spiritual beings, and everything that we have is their body, right? So as we move forward in time, it becomes much less about seeing this world as Maya and an illusion, and much more about embodiment and being in the world, and that special kind of spirituality that comes from that. But you can definitely understand why people would say that. So there is a much greater realization that we need to have about the moon, which is that it reveals to us keys in the evolution of Earth and man. And so we're not getting any nourishment from like thinking that the moon is a machine. Like, that's not telling us anything about our psychology. It's not telling us anything about our soul and our spirit. It's actually keeping us in a childlike condition where we just think that everything is done by like parental, physical, or quasi-physical creatures. It's a complete inversion of how we should view things to be empowered. Okay, so the separation of the moon was discussed quite a bit actually at the turn of the century, and I'm gonna go over a little bit of that with you. Two books that I really recommend checking out are The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison. He goes really into depth about this principle of the two vortices behind all physicality, and also into the spiritual hierarchy's role in a more deep way than I can get into tonight. And the other reference book I want to show you guys is, of course, Cosmic Memory by Rudolf Steiner, who has an entire chapter on the extrusion of the moon. I will summarize both of these a little bit tonight, but I'm going to show you them now. So these are phenomenal resources for what we've covered thus far. You can even see in the Transcendental Universe book, there's the 2 spirals there. It's such a central part of the Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison that he actually included it on the front of the book there. And then, of course, Cosmic Memory by Rudolf Steiner. So, in Transcendental Universe, what's fascinating about C.G. Harrison's take is he really goes into the sort of ascending development of certain angels in the spiritual hierarchy, and then the descending development of angels in the spiritual hierarchy, and how that is part of this mechanism of creation, how these beings are become part of our consciousness and how they work through us. And the other aspect that makes that a good reference book for this topic is that we learn how the elements actually come to be in the cosmos. So how does the element of warmth and heat and fire actually come to exist? Where did that come from? What about air? What about water? And so when we understand the development of the earth through spiritual science, we can see that there were actually several different developments of our earth. So right now we are in what is called the mineral or material development of the earth, or the 4th condition, right? But there are actually 3 prior stages of earthly development in which what we know as the elements were formed. And so the first condition is associated with Saturn. And this is where the element of warmth, of heat, fire is really created. And that is the condensation of very high angelic beings in the spiritual hierarchies of the first hierarchy. And then what we know as fire and heat, that condenses over time in the same manner with the 2 vortexes, and that creates air. So back in earlier periods of earthly development, you only had 2 elements that existed. You only had warmth or fire and air. And that was called Saturn development and Sun development. That went through an entire evolutionary cycle, and then air condensed through the process of these spiraling vortices into water. So condensed air becomes water. And the water development is called the moon development. And the moon phase goes through an entire cycle of evolution. And that then condenses into the material, the mineral, the earth phase of existence. And so all of the elements that have appeared on the earth, we have because they actually represent prior conditions of the earth and prior conditions of man. And we can trace our development back to every single one of these elements. And this is why you'll see these magicians using the elements and referring to the elements, and why they're used in magic and things like this is because they're literally forces within ourselves and forces in the cosmos in which there were actually worlds dedicated to the evolving and creation of that element. Okay, this is all part of spiritual science, and of course, eventually, we all know there will be a 5th element that will come out of the earth. Isn't there a show called The 5th Element? Okay. Now, that is sort of some of the interesting topics that do get discussed in Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison. Let's get into what Rudolf Steiner says about the separation of the moon from the earth in the Lemurian period in his book Cosmic Memory. So in Cosmic Memory, you'll find that Rudolf Steiner gets a little bit more into, what was going on with humanity at the time. So C.G. Harrison, when he discusses the separation of the moon, it's much more technical. You get much more of a view of the real spiritual science behind it, the spiritual hierarchies, all of that. Rudolf Steiner includes that, but then he gets into sort of the effect that the separation of the moon had on humanity and how, I guess you could say, it affected the human form, right? So during the Earth phase, when the moon separated from the Earth, was in the period that we associate with the Garden of Eden. So in occult science, the Earth's development is divided into different epochs, into 7 different epochs. And the moon separates from the Earth in the 3rd epoch, which is called the Lemurian epoch. But in the Bible, it's called the Garden of Eden. And what's fascinating about C.G. Harrison's discussion is he actually says that the Garden of Eden is between the Earth and the moon. Not actually, it's very interesting at the point of separation. That's very interesting about his work, which I think is fascinating. So the separation of the moon happens during the Lemurian epoch, or during what we call the Garden of Eden, right? And what happens is that we associate the separation of the moon actually with the fall of humanity. So it's like as soon as the moon separates, the Earth fully materializes, and we have finally Earth that resembles what we have now. And so you get the materialization of humanity. And this is called the fall because it's really the events that happened when the moon was extruded are deeply intertwined with the fall of man. All of those events, the connection with Lucifer, the entity that is Jehovah, all of that is very much associated with Eden and with early humanity and the Lemurian period and the separation of the moon and this time when humanity finally solidifies. And so another thing that you'll find in spiritual study is that the moon is often associated with also like procreation and often sexuality. And this is because as soon as the moon separates from the Earth and the Earth kind of condenses into its like final mineral form, it finally has that more solidity anyway. The human being actually splits from a hermaphroditic spiritual form into dual sexes. So the separation of the moon from the Earth also marks when humanity becomes dual gendered. Right? And it's silly, it's crazy to think that, but when we see the images of the divine androgen, which I talked about this week on social media, and I talked about in my Law of Polarity video last week, when we see the divine hermaphrodite, that's not talking about a physical thing. That's talking about the time before the moon was extruded from the Earth. That's talking about the time when the Earth and the moon were still one force. And then as soon as the Earth is extruded from the moon, in order for the human form to continue and there to be a fructification of life and the development of mind, we had to have now the two polarities separated into two bodies, and then we had reproduction begin. Before, reproduction happened through basically like a mitosis. It was self-reproduction in a spiritual world. It's hard to imagine this, but this is how it was. And then with the fall of humanity, and this is also why some occultists, when they talk about the fall, they really talk about sex a lot with it. And the sexual impulse and controlling the sexual impulses and things like that, is because as soon as the moon was separated, we get two genders, we get the way that we produce today, and we get something called generation or hereditary. So now, with the separation of the moon, and now we have two genders, now we have basically the ability to create different lineages and lines over time. There is a part of the soul's essence that is able to be held in the form now and carried on, that wasn't able to happen unless we reach the sort of deeper point in matter, okay? And we also began to experience death in a much more intense way as well. So things become more severe. Now, that's what happens to humanity. And there were also angels that were united, as you know, with certain planetary bodies, with the moon and earth development. So there were spiritual beings, angels that were united with the body that was the earth and the moon. And they were working upon humanity in these different ways. And then finally, when these two bodies separate, you also see this bifurcation of spiritual beings. Some spiritual beings separate out and they go with the moon. They're unable to continue developing properly with the earth, right? And so there begins this classical, again, almost like opposing energy that's going on between earth and moon and moon and sun. And there's a separation of spiritual beings that now are, in versions of one another. So here is actually Rudolf Steiner's portrayal of the extrusion of the moon. So you can see the process there. This is on the bottom is a blackboard drawing. And you can see sort of the first image is Earth, Moon. And then you can see the beginning of the extrusion of the moon. And then you can see the moon, and it's actually an inverse image of the Earth. So one is yellow on the inside, pink on the outside, and then the other body is an inverse of that. And so there you have that mirroring component. So the forces in the moon are an inversion of the forces on Earth. They're a mirror image of it. And then up there you can see the other images of the extrusion of the moon. It looks very much like mitosis. It looks very much like something that happens in our body every day. Sometimes it can help to look at at the images. So the other thing that happened is there were also different changes in the human form that are unique to earthly development. Like, for example, the brain the brain also splits into two hemispheres, one representing the sun, one representing the moon, and man gains the capacity of thought and therefore can properly exercise his will. So when humanity was in a lunar condition, it's kind of like they lived inside of a brain, as a hive, if you will. And then once the earthly development began, Now man lives outside of his cognition and can therefore begin to observe himself. So you see these distinct changes as humanity evolves through these different stages where the organs in our body change. We're gaining different qualities. We're gaining, specifically with the earthly development, cognition. Whereas in moon development, humanity and the beings that were involved in that development, they never really got to the stage in which the earth is today. And so this is why the moon is also can be associated with kind of falling behind a little bit. Some of the forces there have fallen behind a little bit. And this is why they seek to develop their capacities through man. Why they interfere with humanity is because humanity has these organs that they were unable to fully develop, right? So there are certain forces that like hung back with the moon that still have this desire to evolve, but try to do it like spiritually through humanity. And that's where you get the idea of all of these spiritual beings surrounding the earth and working through the earth and working through man, but that represent different aspects of God and different phases of development. And the human being, the human consciousness is the force that is to reconcile these through the development of our will and through developing these divine qualities like will, like love, like honoring freedom. And when we develop these virtues and we become strong in them, then these spiritual forces that work through the moon or that work through man, they're redeemed by us. So we, as the center point between opposing vortices, we become the harmonizer. We become the integrator of these different opposing forces, if you will. So the expulsion of the moon was not only a physical event, but also marked a larger process of evolution that led to the dignifying of the two polarities in man. So the extrusion of the men led to the different sexes, led to gender. And this, by the way, is also why there is a gender wound. There is a wound around polarity. There's a wound around sex, is because this was a traumatic experience. And souls actually found it very difficult to divide themselves, to incarnate into a body. They found it difficult to refine their aspects so that they could actually be separated out into these two different polarities, into a male body and a female body. This was not easy for the soul to do. It was an initiation, if you will, to be able to do this. And there were many, many, many souls that still have this wound, right? And so a lot of the sort of challenges we see in society come from, you could say, very deep spiritual shifts or changes that life after life after life we're trying to integrate, right? Not that every single person that has thought about their gender or their sexuality or something is in that boat. What I'm saying is that going from a kind of unified spiritual essence and then having to pour only a part of the consciousness into a form and go through that whole process was challenging, right? So there's always these, you could say, every epoch, there's always some challenge for the individual to take on. There's, the division of gender, and then later on we have the challenge of unifying that polarity, which can only happen through love and integration. And so there's always a challenge. There's always something that needs to be integrated. And that's what causes evolution. So we also see the bilateral composition of the brain, which leads to the capacity to think independently and therefore develop the will, which was not really possible in the lunar period. When the moon separates from the earth, humanity finally becomes a physical dual-sexed being with the ability to procreate. While the earth and moon were united, humanity was in the image of the divine hermaphrodite and in a spiritual form. After the moon separates from the earth, we see the first manifestation of generation, hereditary, the idea of lineage, the idea of ancestry. So when you have a being like before the Lemurian period that produces through mitosis, which is literally creating a being from yourself, you're not getting this idea of lineage and hereditary. That comes through when you have these different varieties of forces that are able to procreate with one another. And so you get this creative power when we also eject the moon, because it is this concept of hereditary and generation comes forward, which is completely new to man. And this is also where you start to see in the Lemurian period and the Atlantean period, you see a lot of traditions around sex. And a lot of the sex magic stuff that people talk about is really going back to these earlier periods when sex just came to be, when procreation just came to be, and we were trying to really master these forces within us. And they were new, and God was really deeply embedded in these forces. But as we move forward, there are different qualities that emerge that we have to integrate. So the emphasis changes a little bit as we move forward. And so this is also where we get, in the Atlantean period, we get this deep obsession with blood memory and tribe, and people, really don't want to procreate with somebody outside of what they consider to be their family, their tribe, because there is this deep spirituality to generation and the cultivation of ancestry and things like this. This is very much part of the Lemurian period, the Atlantean period. But then when we get to the post-Atlantean period, we enter a completely different kind of development, which is, it's about the individual now. And so as we move forward in epochs, we're also challenged to release what was often paramount in earlier epochs to move into developing new qualities. And to develop these new qualities and gain new insights, and we have to release aspects of what we were doing in the prior epoch. And that's also part of how we move forward and evolve, is knowing where we are in time. And where people get really mixed up and start falling into delusions and doing practices and these belief systems that don't represent, their own advancement, is they think that they're in the wrong time. They think that they're in the wrong period. They think that they're in the Lemurian or Atlantean period, and they're not. And this happens all the time with people, right? Is there, even when we're talking about the beings that were extruded with the moon, their whole thing was that they essentially represent a different time of development in the cosmos relative to what the earth represents. And so there's always this element with evil or with destruction or death, that what it really kind of is being out of time, being out of step. And so this takes alertness, it takes awareness, and it takes humbleness, and it takes surrender to God to be able to be in time correctly, in the sense that you're actually dealing with the real impulses that are going to evolve you, and that you're not caught up in, say, lunar impulses or the dark side of these impulses that are emanating patterns and entities and ways of being that do not operate in our particular time, right? So this is also where you see like certain people become super obsessed about like arranged marriages and incredible forms of prejudice, like you can't marry outside, or this kind of stuff, incredible prejudice, this idea of blue bloods and not being able to mix blood. That is all from earlier periods of humanity that doesn't make any sense for our period now. They're carryovers of a time where we had just come into generation. We had just come into even just procreation the way we procreate now. And there were certain spiritualities that emerged from that. There were certain ways of being that emerged from that. But then as we move forward, we carry certain aspects forward, but we release some. And all of it is moving towards you, the individual, being free, a free individual of love. That's what we're moving towards. So also, really the mineral kingdom as we know it comes to be as the basis of man's evolution in the extrusion of the moon. That happens when we eject the moon. So that is a rather, I would say, kind of a more scientific approach to that. But we, as humanity, we weren't always able to see it that way. We weren't able to literally understand all of the minute details about how the Earth separated from the moon and the spiritual beings that are involved in that. And this objective viewpoint wasn't available to us until really only 500 years ago. And so how we learned about the extrusion of the moon and all of the stuff that comes with that was through myth, and was through story, was through allegory. And that's how a lot of these big concepts were explained. They were explained as stories. And so let's get into how the extrusion of the moon and planetary development was talked about and understood in much earlier periods, because the truth was still there. We were still interacting with the concept, but we didn't literally explain it as two opposing vortices crashing together and then creating matter. We didn't see it that way. We're now entering into that, but we had to have it in story, basically. So before we get into this imagery, I just want to remind you guys that any questions that you have, I will be taking on my private platform at gigiyoung.com. So if you are watching this, members, do start to get your questions in. I'm probably only going to go for another half an hour or 45 minutes here. And if you are not a member yet, please do consider signing up. I do a live stream every second Sunday where I just take your questions and we get into everything. We get into politics, we get into the deepest aspects of spirituality. There's an incredible community on gigiyoung.com of mystics and forums, and it's really a great place to go to learn. So if you do want to be part of that, and that includes part of the question and answer portion of this lecture, I'd love to see you over there. So how you could say the saga of separation of the moon from the earth and this process was portrayed was through this motif of dueling brothers or battling brothers, or this idea that there are twin gods that go in these different directions. Okay, so there was often stories, like in every civilization, of a lunar brother who was often portrayed as like dark or black colored. And then there was like a solar brother who was often portrayed as colorful or whatever. And the solar and lunar brother would often, sometimes they would oppose one another and they would battle. Other times they would just simply be existing and representing the dual aspects of God. But this idea of part of cosmic evolution being this bifurcation of streams of development. I mean, we even see this in the New Age with this idea of like, the 5D Earth, or the new Earth and the old Earth. There was this concept, and there still is, that the Earth is going to bifurcate. There's going to be two streams that come about, and you have this higher Earth, which is called the 5D Earth, and then you have this lower Earth that is like the dross, or the waste of what could not be transformed, what could not essentially align with Christ. And this sort of stays behind and becomes the Mula Prakriti. It becomes the body of the Divine Mother. It dissolves into the primordial chaos. It falls back into the primordial chaos to begin again. And so that is all imagery of this as well. And even in the Christian tradition, there is this idea of New Jerusalem. And that in anthroposophy is Jupiter. It's the Jupiter development, which in the New Age is called 5D Earth. And these are all the same concepts of bifurcation, which is the same principle that leads us to understanding how the moon separated from the earth and why the moon is significant to our development. Of course it is. If it was literally part of us at one point, of course it is. That's why we feel so much about the moon. It's why our ancestors planted their crops around the moon. It's why they would live their lives around it, not because they were, evil worshiping something. It's because it has quite an effect on our etheric body, on our bodies, because it was part of it. It's part of us. Just simply because it's extruded doesn't mean that it's not having an effect on us. So that's why this understanding is so important, is because when we look up into the cosmos, we are looking at quite literally parts of ourselves, parts of our being. If we understand that this bifurcation of forces and then the reunification of them is part of our larger macro evolution, we can understand why they have such a pull on us, right? So this lunar element is associated with, black sun forces. It's associated with sort of this, this past element of humanity, this kind of unhealed portion. And that would be a real impulse that people knew about, that people would feel within themselves. It was called the Ida in the Indian tradition. The Ida channel of the body is the lunar channel. The Pingala was the solar channel, right? So even our early ancestors, they understood that there were sort of these different elements, these two different spirals that were working through man. And so how they used to portray that was often through this idea of twins. And now twins come from one mother, one substance, one mother substance. And then they separate out from it. That's just like the moon and the earth. One brother, one substance goes and becomes fructified and resonates with higher forces than the sun. The other is drawn more downwards. There's an ascending force and a descending force in the cosmos that is the production of all life. That is the mechanism of all life. And so there is sometimes the solar brother is portrayed as literally slaying or killing the lunar brother. Other times, as we'll see, the solar brother is subduing or pushing aside his lunar aspect. And so let's take a look at this. I think the most popular one that you guys would maybe think of is this image of Cain and Abel. And we have some images here of the biblical Cain and Abel. And so Cain here is representing the solar force, or this masculine element. And the Abel force is the lunar mansion, the feminine element. So Abel, as the lunar element, is the culmination of all of the past developments of man, right? This is why God favors him in a way, is because in a sense, Abel is complete and is the substrate for the new world. Cain is the solar impulse in this case, and is a new impulse that man is sort of challenged to integrate, right? But humanity contains both of these impulses, contains the solar and lunar impulse, the Cain impulse and the Abel impulse, and you can't really let one rule the other. And that's part of the message here, is you have to integrate both of these two forces, and you do that through the Christ impulse within your being, which is the center, straight, upright nature associated with the Sushumna as well. So when it comes to part of this mystery, it's that man must acknowledge and understand his past and what has brought him up to this point, which is Abel, while also integrating the new impulse of the epoch, which produces life and forward advancement, which is Cain. And eventually the solar brother often slays the lunar brother, because it is the fruits and the products of the solar brother that lead eventually to something new, life being developed. Okay, so that's part of that temple legend, that mystery. And also the new impulse takes over the old because it produces something new. Now, also in the Christian mysteries, there is an image of Michael and Lucifer that's very similar. So here are some images here of Michael on the top there, and he's subduing Lucifer. And so this is a little bit of a different thing, but here Lucifer is more associated with the lunar force, and Michael is more the solar force. But you could also look at it this way, in that Michael is like the matured sun forces, which are Christ's literal countenance. So Michael is Christ's countenance in the world, his expression in the world. And then Lucifer, in a sense, is sort of like the immature solar forces in man, in a way. And so Lucifer contains sun forces, and I have to address this because Lucifer means light, and he does have associations with the sun. But the Luciferic forces in man are not fully developed, while the Michaelic impulses are the real matured lineage of the Luciferic line. So when Michael is portrayed as slaying Lucifer, one way to look at that is that you have this sort of fallen, immature solar impulse being overtaken naturally by the matured solar impulse, if you will. So another example of this battling brothers mythos is, of course, Egypt. So here we have Osiris, which is the light brother, and he also represents, you could say, order, right? Osiris is like the father energy. And then you have Sut, and Sut is the dark brother. Sut is chaos, and he's the fellow there that looks like he has a canine face. Now, Sut kills Osiris and dismembers him. And then Isis, who is Osiris's wife, puts Osiris back together and creates Horus. Now, Horus is obviously the hawk-headed figure in the other image. And then, of course, Horus avenges his father and restores order again. So here in the image of Sut and Osiris, or Set and Osiris, we're again seeing this idea of battling and dueling brothers. Okay, we're seeing that dark and light come to pass in mythology, which is the same concept that's coming forward with the separation of the moon and certain forces being cast out or cast aside, and the natural antagonism there is between something that is properly in time, which creates order, and impulses that are out of time, which create chaos. So if you were to get to again look at, the lunar brother, the dark brother, the chaotic brother, if you were to look at that from a truly exalted spiritual view, you would say, listen, it's not that Seth is evil, right? Or that any of these brothers are evil. It's that what their essence really is again out of time. And so when they enter into space, they create darkness, and it interferes with order. So that is really the deeper imagery we're looking at. But the experience of that is not so nonchalant. When you are living your life as a human being, right, and you experience like something that is from the lunar development, that is an inverse to where we are now, and it is actually feels parasitic. It feels painful, actually, because we're operating on a different system that is calling forth new forces in our being. And so the lunar forces are like an inversion of where we are now, which is why the experience of it is dark and it's painful. But from the highest spiritual perspective, these inverted forces are a divine impulse out of place. The experience of it is not so casual, but that's how it's explained from a completely objective place. And that's why people also get in trouble, is they kind of intellectualize it too much, and they think, oh, well, the dark forces are just an impulse out of time. So there's nothing really dark about them, or whatever it is. And that's how people get caught up also in black magic and darker things, is they learn that The darkness is something that's out of time. That's a divine impulse that's operating in the wrong time. And they think that they can mitigate that. When in reality, how this plays out can actually be quite frightening, can be quite scary. Okay. And perhaps one of the more famous images, especially for anthroposophists, is the Zoroastrian image, the Persian image of the two brothers, which is Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. There they are. So I really like this one by Anuki, this colorful one on the side there, because it actually shows the Ahrimanic brother with the moon above him. And then it really shows the solar brother with the sun above him. And I really like that contrasting imagery because it really shows this idea that these are twins that are opposing one another. Okay. And then you can see the classical imagery of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman on the side, where this is one of those imageries again where he's not exactly necessarily slaying Ahriman, right? But he's keeping him at bay by grabbing his horn and slaying him. And a lot of the time also, some of the, when angels fall, or when you have this inverted aspect represented in occult imagery, sometimes they appear as animal anthropomorphic forms. So the lunar brother will sometimes be portrayed as having more of an animal nature, more anthropomorphic sometimes than the solar brother, to represent that, you know, there's this unrefined level of his being that doesn't exist, that compared to the solar impulse. So fallen angels will often have insect parts, or certain monsters are portrayed as a bit more anthropomorphic. And that kind of spirituality was also very typical for these earlier periods for humanity as well. Going back into the lunar development of man, the human form also would at times flash through animal forms in the human form. So that is very much an image of the lunar period, where the human form actually would kind of be like a morphing spiritual image, where it would have animal parts that would appear on the form and then disappear. And the human form was not solid. This is why people have trouble, I think, with spirituality and going into the deep history like this, is people are like, what? Like, you had an animal part, but this is part of the lunar development, and even the earlier development of the earth before people took, we did not always have this physical form that we have now and exist in the way that we exist now, right? This is part of how deeply we've sunk into materialism, where it's like we can't even fathom a kind of life or a way of living that is outside of our current paradigm, yet a large portion of our development was. And a huge portion of how our consciousness operates is because of these prior developments. And so why it's important to talk about them, no matter how weird it sounds, is that how you become a conscious participant in your own spirituality is by being able to go back this far and start to understand this. Otherwise, you're not consciously participating in your life, because you don't understand exactly how you got to be where you are and the prior conditions of your own being, How are you going to have any authority in the world or your life if you don't have that? Right? And in earlier periods, people knew this. They understood that. I mean, if you look at, First Nations belief systems, there was an incredible sense of animism. They understood that these forces were flowing through them and that we were one, right? It's something that we have lost in order to gain our individuality and to be able to receive the Christ impulse fully. We had to let go of this early clairvoyance we had, this sort of malleability to be able to shift and embody these different things, different forces. But when we did that, when we did give it up, we gained the ability to truly be an individual and to have the forces of Christ work within us, which is a requirement. So you need that individuality. You need to be an individual. You need the consciousness that comes along with that. So the next dueling brothers that we see are actually from the Aztec tradition. And here they are. Okay. So please do not get mad at me for butchering the name here, but you have Quetzalcoatl there. And Quetzalcoatl is the solar brother, or sometimes described as the light point of Venus, or I think he's the morning star. And then you have Xochitl, and he is the dark brother. And now he represents, I believe, the evening aspect of Venus. And now if you understand occult science, the sun and Venus are united. The sun development and Venus development are sort of parallel to one another. So it's very interesting that the Mesoamerican tradition uses Venus like that, because that is still parallel with the idea of the sun in occult development. So you have Xotl or Zotl on the one side there. And what's really interesting is that he's actually portrayed as a canine. He's actually portrayed as a dog-headed god. And why that's striking is that if you take a look at Set, he's also often associated with having a canine head and being black. And people would sometimes think that he's very similar to Anubis, right? And so it's just fascinating that you have these different cultures from different places in the world, and they both have like this black canine looking god that represents the underworld, that represents the lunar portion of consciousness, or this the dark brother, this kind of antagonist role, right? And so people say that Sut here is not a jackal or a canine. Some people think that he is. He's portrayed as a donkey at times, but I still think it's fascinating that he does have that jackal appearance, and it is very similar to the dark brother there. Now, Quetzalcoatl doesn't battle with his sort of lunar twin. What happens is that Quetzalcoatl goes through a fire, or kind of faces his fears, and becomes this triumphant figure that is kind of like a Christ figure to humanity. And then, according to the legend, Xochitl doesn't go through the fire. He doesn't go through the flames, and he stays behind and he weeps. And so even with this Mesoamerican Aztec legend, there's this imagery of, there's this solar brother, this solar impulse that goes forward, that fructifies the earth, that leads humanity, that even saves humanity, that raises humanity, right, into a higher state. And then there's also this other aspect of him, this twin, this brother. Now, sometimes they're portrayed as twins and sometimes they're just brothers. But there's this other brother that stays behind, that doesn't go through the fire. And he actually ends up becoming the god of the underworld. And so it's very similar to the Egyptian belief in that the sun disappears at night and then comes again in the morning, but it's Quetzalcoatl and his lunar brother that sort of are a big part of that process. But in the Aztec version, you know, they don't fight. You don't have one brother slaying the other or anything like that. It's just that they represent opposing forces. They're the same, they're brothers and they represent opposing positions. Just like the earth and the moon and the sun and the moon. Okay. This idea of the battling and dueling brothers also exists in the Sumerian tradition as well. And it's actually so similar to Cain and Abel that different scholars think that this is sort of a story that made it into the Bible that was portraying something very primordial. And it is that there's basically two seasons. There is Amesh, which is light and summer and is a farmer. And then there's Enten. And this is winter and darkness and is a shepherd. And so they end up fighting with one another, battling with one another, and Enlil, or God, ends up saying that winter, or Abel, you know, is the winner because because the waters that fall in the winter allow the crops in the summer to grow. And so you have a very similar story told in Sumeria there to Cain and Abel, a very similar imagery to other cultures as well, but that really also encapsulates this idea of the solar and the lunar impulse, in that what is brought forth is basically the lunar impulse is everything that has come, everything that has happened up until that point. And so it's really the foundation for the next phase. So God favors that, right? And then from that, the new life begins. And so that is such a similar story. And I also noticed that the moon development is associated with water. It literally is a water world. So it's a liquid development. And it's interesting to me that in this version, it actually talks about the winter being associated with water, obviously, like monsoon season and the rains and all that. But it is from water, from a liquid condition, that all matter emerges, right? And so that is a fascinating element of that as well, that's portrayed in the form of story and in the form of myth, that actually is archetypally accurate. It's because we didn't have the ability to actually be like, oh, and then the moon and the earth were one coalescing body in the spiritual world, and then they separated out, and the spiritual hierarchies formed spinning vortexes, and if we couldn't do that, these symbolic stories are laying the foundation for that understanding. They're pretty close, right? These two opposing forces and bringing forth new life. There's also, similar to that, one in the Aesop's fables, where you have winter, a conversation between winter and spring, and winter represents like death, a time of death, it's the closing of last season. And again, it's this foundation in which the spring will bear fruit. And so again, that is actually talking about the evolution of a sphere, the evolution of life. But we can apply that to a planetary meaning. And these forces, as I mentioned, are also in the Eastern mysteries. And in the incredible thing about the Eastern mysteries is that was the time when humanity was very deeply understanding physicality and the spiritual forces in the body, and how the human body is patterned by spiritual forces. That's where we get the idea of yoga. That's where we get the incredible, Eastern medicine techniques that address the entire spirit, the entire person. And so you actually have different channels in the body. You have the Ida, which is the lunar channel on the left side of the body. You have the Pingala, which is the solar channel on the right side of the body. And that is literally how those forces move through you. And then you have the Sushumna channel, which is straight up the spine, which is sort of like that upright Christ impulse between the two. So you even have this idea of transformation within your own body with the solar and lunar channels. We are literally patterned on it. The two spiraling vortexes, the lunar and solar channels. It is such a part of our existence. And part of this, and we will just touch on this a little bit, as part of this is also the mystery of Gemini, the mystery of Gemini. And Gemini is, of course, the twins. And it's like, it is a mystery as to why it is that at one point, these can be twin brothers of the same mother, the same egg, yet have different natures. They are twins of the same egg, of the same substrate, yet governed perhaps by different fathers, one by the old father and one by the new. And so there's a deep mystery in regards to Gemini with this, the mystery of Gemini in this as well. All right, so this concludes our first lecture on the moon. Now we know that while there's a lot of sensational information about the moon, and I will agree that the moon may have some unusual characteristics. And I've talked about this in my last Mars Mysteries episode, which was maybe 4 months ago now. But just because a planetary body has unusual characteristics, like maybe the moon is hollowed out, maybe there are structures on different planets, that doesn't mean that aliens did it. And that doesn't mean that not only did some extraterrestrials do it, that it is fully a negative controlling force. There's so much effort to make people, there's been so much effort in the last few decades in the kind of books that come out, the kind of shows that become popular. There's so much effort to make people fear the moon and to make people think of the moon as a separate force that has no connection with the earth at all. Now, knowing what we know now, listening to this lecture, why would there be forces, people that would want that to be the image? Why is that so popular? Why is it so trendy to want to see the moon as basically a repulsive thing, an evil thing? So we're going to get into this in our next installment of Moon Mysteries, which is that the moon is also synonymous with the Divine Mother and the feminine. And the picture of the moon as being something that is needing to be dominated, something to be controlled, something to be made a machine, something to be visualized as a machine, is going to become very central in our series here, Revival and Moon Mysteries. Because what happens when certain forces become imbalanced on the earth is that to actually have total power, the feminine must be subjectified. It must be completely and totally controlled and used as a substrate for darker forces. She must be removed and turned into her most base functions, which is psychic connection and procreation. It is incredibly important that satanic forces on the planet, Antichrist forces on the planet, do that. And by painting the moon as a dangerous force, a controlling force, you're actually, what's happening is you're psychologically making people have a poor image of the feminine within themselves and the world, because the moon is also shown as a deep part of the feminine consciousness. It's the feminine that is the Mula Prakriti, the divine body that holds all life. And so this imagery that we repeatedly see in the New Age, in the conspiracy community, about the moon being nothing more than this robot thing, is a projection of what certain forces on this planet would love to do to the feminine consciousness. You see these fake wombs coming up. You see, these bizarre ideas about gender coming up. This is part of breaking the human spirit by disturbing our understanding of the law of polarity in the human being, but also in its symbolic, its expressions in the spheres. So there is a deep mysticism to the moon, a deep kind of mysticism to the moon that belongs to women and that belongs to the feminine consciousness. And right at this point in our development, as we enter the age of the Holy Spirit, is when that is supposed to rise. And it's not a competition with masculine forces at all. It strengthens and ennobles the masculine forces when the feminine rises. It makes their job easier. And so all of this imagery of the moon being like this surveillance object, this machine, having no connection to the earth, being brought here by aliens, all of these weird conspiracy and New Age ideas, how that operates inside of you is that it disconnects you from your own feminine consciousness. It disconnects you from the evolution of the planet. It disconnects you from the evolution of yourself. And it weaves you into an harmonic machine cosmos that is an externalist and materialist perspective. And so we are going to go deeper and deeper into the moon and into the feminine mysteries, and we are going to track with this and uncover every single stone so that it becomes clear. All right, so I'm going to read this final paragraph, and I'm going to then disappear from YouTube and from the public sphere, and I'm going to appear on my member site, and I'm going to take questions. So you'll have about 5 minutes or so to sign up if you want to join. If not, I will see you right back here very soon. All right. The battling brother mythologies represent not actual people, but rather different streams of development that make up human evolution. There is generally a solar brother that represents the process of self-actualization and differentiation, and a lunar brother that represents the culmination of all past developments. The past developments of man, the past truths, will find themselves in natural opposition with the solar brother when the Christ impulse cannot be accepted and understood. The Christ impulse stands between the two as a mitigating forces that harmonizes the underdeveloped lunar and solar forces. In man, this is symbolized by the Ida and the Pingala and the spinal channel. These mysteries were conveyed through metaphorical stories because in earlier periods we did not have the degree of consciousness to see the world spiritually, objective spiritually. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you right back here very soon.